The reason why programs and entertainment focus so much on violence really varies somewhat. There are a number of reasons. Sometimes there are a certain political message that certain film producers and film sponsors really believe in. For instance, that we need to use war and violence as a way of fighting the communists. That's the explicit reason why movies like Uncommon Valor are made. Programs like Delta Force are financed by the Israeli government. It's to help sell a certain political message that the producers really believe in, and from our own analysis, they're really misguided, but they're sincere. In the case of war toys, we have quite a number of war cartoons showing on Australian television, and the reason they're there is to help sell the toys. And they find that, you know, it's hard to sell a comedy toy. It's easier to sell a gun. You've got something that you can sell. And they find that, especially to young boys, selling them violence is a good way to maximize their profits. What's surprising to us that the Israeli government, like the United States government, I mean the Australian government, like the United States government, is sitting back idly and letting these corporations engage in this really immoral and what should be illegal trade practice of taking over children's programming and turning it into 30-minute advertisements for toys with violent themes.
That was Dr. Thomas Radecky, an American psychiatrist and chairman of the United States-based National Coalition on Television Violence, as well as the chairman of the International Coalition Against Violent Entertainment. In recent years, Dr. Radecky has supervised extensive research into the effects of television violence and violent entertainment. Dr. Radecky was brought to Australia in March 1987 to conduct a series of public meetings and seminars in Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney and Adelaide for the Australian Children's Television Action Committee, whose executive committee member is Mary Murdoch. Mary, why did ACTAC bring Dr. Radecky to Australia?
Because for many years we have been very concerned about the amount of violent entertainment shown on television screens in Australia, and we wanted to highlight that. We're particularly concerned with the effects it has on children, the violent entertainment, and we believe producers, company owners and everyone in the community should be aware of this.
Just explain why that is of concern to ACTAC.
The effects of violence are seen in the way children behave, the way they react to various situations. They always seem to respond in a fairly violent way to ordinary situations which annoy them if they have been watching violent entertainment. And there is so much research about the effect of violence on children, and we felt that Dr. Radecky, who is such an expert on it, was the one to tell us more about it.
All right, so just again, what is ACTAC's attitude to violence on television?
We do not believe in violent entertainment being shown on television, especially when children are watching, and we think that everyone in the community is becoming desensitised to violence, and so we are accepting more and more of it, and the effects then are being shown more and more in our community.
Thank you for that. We asked Dr. Radecky 3 questions. How does he define television violence? Is there a difference between fantasy violence? And how does he know that violent entertainment is harmful?
For our research work, we're primarily contained about entertainment, when violence is used to entertain people. And by violence, we mean the intentional and hostile use of physical force by one person against another. Certainly, verbal violence is also of a concern, but the research really has focused primarily on physical violence, beatings, kicking, shooting, killing, rapes, that type of thing. And the research shows that when we use that type of material as a means of entertainment, when we show good repeatedly turning to violence as a way of solving problems, that unconsciously we're having a harmful effect on normal viewers. Well, yes, there's a definite difference between fantasy violence and documentary violence. I think the bottom line, though, is whether the violence is being used in an educational manner or whether it's being used to entertain. We find even in news programming, if violence is being used sensationalistically to make the news more exciting, say some unimportant suicide being brought over from another country to make the news more of a grabber, that type of sensationalistic violence actually has a harmful effect on viewers, can increase suicide rates in the local viewing area significantly. Well, actually, the expression overwhelming evidence of harmful effects comes from the U.S. Surgeon General. He had a panel of 7 expert researchers go over the evidence, analyze all the studies that had been done up through 1982, and they came to the conclusion that there was overwhelming evidence. Actually, at this point, there are now some 1,000 research studies and reports on the issue of violent entertainment, and overwhelmingly, the vast majority of them show over and over again harmful effects. There are some that don't find any effects, and there's an extremely small number that find positive effects. Those tend to be older studies. When they've gone over those studies and repeated them, they found that those studies were mistaken, and actually, instead of decreasing violence, that watching violence actually increases your tendency to violence. Again, that's entertainment violence. There actually is some research showing that programs like Holocaust, talking about the genocide of the Jewish and Polish and Gypsy people by the Nazi regimes, be viewing that type of documentary or educational violence actually made the viewers more sensitive to violence and in essence helping decrease their tendency towards violence in their own lives.
Anne Knowles is a psychology lecturer at Swinburne Institute of Technology, and you're working on a PhD on children and television. How do you react to Dr Radecky's claims?
Well, I certainly think that television content affects children. I think there's evidence, certainly evidence that happens. I think, though, that Dr Radecky overstates the effect of violence on television on children, and I think also perhaps he oversimplifies the issues. I think that's perhaps the risk with his approach. I think that researchers looked at both child effects and television content effects. There's clear evidence that children of different ages process television differently, so that young children do not understand television in the same way that adults do or that older children do. Just one example, a study that looked at children's understanding of reasons for committing aggressive acts and the consequences of those acts, found that a third of 5-year-old children didn't understand either the reasons for the acts or the consequences of them, whereas 3/4 of the 11-year-olds did. Now, we can certainly assume that those 5-year-olds perhaps will not have established the link that if there was an aggressive act and it was punished, that occurred, so that they may be more likely to imitate the behaviour that they've seen than a child who's seen that behaviour was punished.
Let's bring it closer to home. What do we specifically know from Australian research into this field?
Yes, well, probably the best Australian study that's been done has been done by Professor Peter Sheehan up at Brisbane University, and he completed a long-term study fairly recently. He found no relationship between children's watching of aggressive television and their subsequent aggression, and that fits in with, in fact, most of what you could call the field studies, the more lifelike studies that have tended not to find relationships between viewing violence on television and subsequent violent behaviour over years, although some studies have found it. Now, Peter Sheehan's study didn't find a relationship between children's watching of television violence and their aggression, but they did, interestingly, find a relationship between the children's parents' watching of violent television and children's aggression. And that supports other evidence that parents and perhaps children's friends, important people in their lives, seem to mediate the effect of aggression on television.
Right, thank you for that. Monica Persson is a primary teacher and an education officer for the Australian Teachers of Media. Monica, as a teacher, how do you react to Dr Radecky's claims in this field?
I feel that Dr Radecky has a lot that is valid in his point of view. I wasn't entirely aware of how many acts of violence took place in a cartoon program, for example. But I do think perhaps he's a little extreme in his view.
Is there a role for media teachers and media education in this area?
Well, yes. Violence is one of the issues that we'd be looking at in a media education program in our schools. It gives us the possibility of looking at alternatives. There are many ways that violence can be resolved, or conflict can be resolved in different ways, and a violent ending doesn't have to be the way. So with children, we could look at a program such as any of the ones that they are familiar with, Miami Vice and whatever, and we could stop it and say, right, this action has taken place. Now, give us many different ways of how you'd resolve it. That's just a simple way, I suppose.
Does that involve a range of classroom methods and activities from writing to play acting?
Yes. One of the important emphases in media education is the activity. People look at the media, they analyse what's going on, and then a very important part is to put yourself in the place of the director, the producer, and try to do it yourself. It gives the children a greater understanding of the way the media communication area works.
Well, Dr Radecky visited your students at Murrumbina Primary School and talked with them about their television viewing habits.
Now, why do we keep watching violent shows when we shouldn't?
If you watch a few violent movies, it's like you get addicted to it and you can't stop watching violent movies, and you have to watch all the violent movies they're on.
So the more you watch, you get into a habit,
Yeah, because if you keep watching them, you get addicted to it and you can't stop.
A few minutes ago we were talking. Everybody here says they lose their tempers sometimes, huh?
Yeah.
How many times a week do you lose your temper in some little way?
Oh, about, not varies.
Varies?
5 to 6.
5 to 6 once a day? How many people lose their temper about once a day? Okay, a lot of people. How many people lose their temper more than once a day? No, I just want to... That's okay. Do you have a question there you wanted to say?
No.
No? Okay. So how many people's parents lose their tempers at least once a week? Oh, so most people's parents lose their tempers sometimes too, huh? How many people here thought it had bad effects on them? Just you personally. You think that the TV programs you've watched have had a bad effect on you? How about you?
I think that the kids at school, last year they were having a fight and they were wrestling, like WrestleMania that was on TV,
Right.
and some people were getting hurt.
Yes, so that was getting them fighting,
And some people, they watch violent movies, they usually at late, they don't get much sleep, and sometimes they usually have nightmares.
Nightmares,
Last year when all these kids went around with sticks, they did that for the movies, like shooting with guns.
So a lot of the people play the superheroes they see on television,
And there was 2 murderers that went around the streets and murdered a few people. There was Mad Max and Rambo.
What happens when kids are playing Transformers on the playground?
Like if somebody gets hurt in a play fight and they want to get them back, they might just like trip them over, and then it starts into then he pushes them back, and it starts into a big
So
fight.
the kids that are play fighting, then somebody gets hurt, they're more likely to lose their tempers, but the kids that are like skipping a rope and somebody gets hurt, they don't lose their tempers as fast. Is that right? Are we teaching kids peace, or are we teaching them war when we're playing Transformers? War. Do you think that's true? We're teaching, when we play this war, we're rehearsing war, is that right?
Yeah.
Tony Summers is an executive producer of children's and educational television for the ABC. What are your reactions to what Dr Radecky has to say?
I have a few problems with Dr Radecky. Perhaps it's because of his rather zealous approach. The big worry for me is that while I don't disapprove at all, in fact I agree with a lot of his basic comments about very violent programs, when he talks about rapes and murders and things like that, that's okay. But what he tends to do is extrapolate from that and cover a much broader range, all sorts of programs. And in fact, the opening titles of this program with Tom and Jerry and things like that are indicating that. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, that you can't talk about an extreme at one end of the scale and then run right through to the other.
Well, are there differences between violence on news and current affairs programs and in fictional programs, dramas, for instance?
Oh, I think of course there are. Now, I have responsibility for Behind the News, which is a television program which uses news resources, and we find every week that we have to be very careful about what vision we actually put to air, because the program is being aimed at 11-year-olds, and as a result we censor it. And certainly in my experience, children are much more upset by what they see on a news program than what they would see, say, in a program that they know is fictional. You can wreck 1 million cars on the A-Team and they don't bat an eyelid.
Thank you for that. Dr Radecky also commented on 3 issues: sponsorship of violent TV programs in the United States, concerns of parents, as well as the Australian program rating system.
There are some advertisers that prefer violent programs because they're trying to reach male audiences. In the United States, for instance, we find the U.S. military, automobile advertisers, and beer advertisers prefer violent programs because it gets them the type of all-male audience or mostly male audience that they're seeking. They don't really want to have to pay for the female viewers because they don't drink as much beer or aren't as likely to volunteer for the military. And so they prefer to place their ads on violent programs and in essence help subsidize the violence. There are concerns by women's groups in the United States about the television violence issue, not as strong as we would like, but actually individual women, there's a huge percentage of women right now in America concerned about this issue. A recent survey by Women's Day magazine found that 88% of female readers thought that television violence was a cause of violence in our society, and roughly half of them had noticed some harmful effects on their own children. So people do see it as a real problem. The difficulty in the United States is that the government refuses to follow through really studying the issue and trying to decide what the proper way for a democracy is to deal with this problem. We think it's educational, putting the honest truth on television so people can get both sides of the story, not the one-sided promotion of violence that we're currently seeing on American and Australian television, but periodically get some information to help them understand that it's not just whether the good guy wins or not, it's how the good guy wins that determines the message being taught. Rating system for television by our recent survey of Australian primetime and daytime programming really is falling far short of the mark. In Melbourne, during 1 week of programming, we found 93 hours of programming that is high in violence, likely to have harmful effects on normal viewers, children and adults. 25 of those 93 hours were rated G. We're talking about very heavy-duty war cartoons that are being aimed at children, cowboy shows, swashbuckling, sword fighting, knights in shining armor types of programs, programs that really average up to 88 acts of violence being rated G, and in previous research having already been shown to have a harmful effect on normal viewers, especially children viewers in the case of many of these programs.
We've been talking about our parents watching television when they watch the violent programs. The children are obviously aware that some programs, their parents are more angry afterwards. How can they talk to their parents about the programs that they think they'd like their parents to watch? When we watch The Cosby Show, parents are usually much happier. Can they say to their parents, I noticed how much happier you were after you'd watched The Cosby Show tonight, Mum, whereas when you've been watching Miami Vice or The Equalizer, you're usually really grumpy or grouchy or you lose your temper. Well, is there a way that you'd recommend that they speak to their parents?
Well, I don't know. What do you guys think?
You tell them if they're worried about how much effect violent programs have on you, you tell them it has just as much effect on them. Yeah. Your parents can't hide it forever that they're having nightmares or haven't got anyone to run to, and sometimes they'll have to admit so they can just watch good shows like The Cosby Show or Elfman or funny ones.
Yeah.
You could have a television discussion on what things are good for you and what things are bad for you.
Well, I think that's a real good idea. So let's pretend that we got 30 seconds, just a little bit of time on TV to teach this message, okay? How are we going to start out the commercial? How many people are going to be in the shot and what are they going to be doing, okay? What are we going to okay, yeah? Uh-huh.
We could start off with a scene in the lounge room where the parents are watching a violent program and the kids walk in and the program's just finished, and then they have a little bit of writing just up along the bottom that says 3 hours later, and you might have spilled a glass of milk and they really blow their top.
A number of issues raised there. Let's pick up on some of them for a couple of minutes. The role of parents. Mary, what do you...
I think parents need to be aware of what the television set is doing to their children and themselves, and they should have a lot more control over the set. Many homes have television on the whole time. It is a favourite occupation and a favourite backdrop for most homes, and I think it should be a question of switching it off if there is something unsuitable or which is violent, especially when there are children around, but being really aware of what's going on.
And you said earlier that you wanted to make a point about fantasy violence and violent reality. Does that have anything to do with the role of parents or the way television's watched in homes?
Yes, excuse me. I think it does. I think that the research evidence suggests that preschool children believe television is literally true. so that they really believe what they see. They start to realise then that animated programs are not so realistic, and by about 7 or 8, most children have a fairly accurate understanding of the distinction between reality and fantasy. So that I think it's true that the violence on television that is most likely to have an effect on children is realistic violence, and violence that's easily imitated by children. So I think that those sorts of incidents, if possible, ought to be vetted by parents. I think the evidence also suggests that another thing parents can do is attempt to teach their children values and behaviours that are non-violent, preferably before the children see too much violent television.
Is it a problem that those parents of the age of people that we've seen so far are themselves the first Australian television generation?
This could be a problem, that the parents... What is a problem is if the parents say to the children, don't watch violence, but then the children see the parents watching violence and enjoying it themselves. Now, children will do what they see their parents doing, not what the parents tell them to do, so that children will not learn to disapprove of violence if they see that their parents are enjoying it.
Monica, teachers are taught to preview audio-visual material that they're going to present to their classes. Should parents adopt a similar method in previewing programs that might be excessively violent in their opinion for their kids?
Oh, most definitely. I'd have to agree with both Anne and Mary on that. We tend to let the children just sit and watch the television as a babysitter, and we're not aware of what is going on, whether it is a cartoon program or it is something of the violent nature of The Equaliser. We don't know what they're seeing. I've been horrified when I've actually been sitting watching a program to see something about to take place, and my children have been there. So I'm guilty of it, but we should all really perhaps use the science technology of the video to perhaps see the programs before the children do.
Tony, is there a problem for people supplying programs now? The Children's and Education Department of the ABC has to supply, what, 8 hours of material a day?
Well, overall we're supplying about 10.5 hours a day.
So you include times that schools are not only watching, but right. Let's call it general viewing time
that's
after
correct.
school.
That's correct. It is very difficult to sift through material. For instance, with animations, we could pack the schedule wall to wall with so-called violent cartoons, which are usually things like Transformers and the like.
So do you have a problem with that after school and before tea time?
No, well, we put a different sort of factor on it, and basically you usually find that a lot of this stuff is just plain bad television, so you don't buy it. The answer might well be to get children to be a little more discriminating, not just with about the content in terms of violence of what they watch, but also to know a rotten program when they see it, and perhaps get them to learn to turn it off.
Well, Dr Radecky was asked what should be done to educate people and what measures could be used to protect children and adults.
I think that what we need to do is educate people. Very few children and adults realize that violence has a harmful effect on them personally, that violent entertainment increases their tendency to lose their tempers. People just aren't sensitive to that. They haven't been told that. That information's been really kept secret from them. Most people think that as long as a program doesn't make them nervous, and as long as it doesn't keep them up too late at night, that it really doesn't have a harmful effect. And the research shows very much the opposite. In order to alter the serious problem that we're having right now with violence on Australian television and video cassette and other types of entertainment material, I think what we need to do is a several-fold educational approach. One, to have an honest rating system that doesn't rate programs high in violence and a G rating, doesn't give PG to programs that really have very large amounts of violence, really takes violence seriously in the rating system, and doesn't look mainly at sexual content, but looks at both. The second thing is I think a lengthening of the family viewing time, where we extend the family viewing time from 7:30 to 8:30, so programs particularly high in violence are not coming on that early in the evening. I think the third and most important thing is that we put the honest information on television, perhaps every 4 to 6 hours, a little 30-second commercial on television, helping the average viewer know that normal people like you and I, both normal children and normal adults that were affected when we use violence as a way to entertain ourselves in subtle ways, small ways, but important ways in the long run, and that we need to choose our entertainment more carefully. We need to turn the channel or turn off the set. Putting that information out there, helping people realize that it's not just whether the good guy wins or not, but how the good guy wins that's teaching the message. I think that's a very important thing for us to do.
Yeah. In the time that's left to us, I want to talk about some of the future directions or developments that may exist in television, particularly children's television viewing. Mary, what are we likely to see in the near future? Have we become more violent viewers than we were 30 years ago?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, what's going to happen in the next 30 years then?
Well, I think we have to try and raise the consciousness of the community so that we do not go on and on down this track of violent entertainment and also perhaps violence on the news. We believe that the family viewing time should be extended to 8:30 so that the violent programs under our current rating system don't start until after that time, when one would hope that more children would be in bed. We've also always advocated that violence on the news should be shown visually after 9 p.m. and only talking heads or so on earlier than that. We believe our politicians should be always aware of the problems of showing violent entertainment to children, whatever age. Those are the sort of things we would like to see happen.
Well, Tony, you've got a real problem in the future with accommodating and the changes in supplying programs to an ever-changing audience out there.
Yes, it's a major problem, but in many ways it's not much different to what it is now. It really depends on the networks. If you're purchasing for children's television time, you tend not to purchase the offending programs anyway. The problem comes, as Mary said, when you move into the 7 o'clock, 6 to 7 o'clock, if the commercials are running news at 6, and through to 7:30, 8:30. I don't know that there's a great deal that you can do about that, except, yes, if news is on in G time, keep it G.
All right. Tony Summers, Monica Persson, Anne Knowles, Mary Murdoch, thanks for discussing television violence and children with us today. And until next time, see you then.
Victorian schools can obtain a copy of this program by sending a blank cassette and a dubbing request form to the Videotape Dubbing Service, Curriculum Branch, 234 Queensbury Street in Carlton, 3053. Victorian School Inquiries, telephone 03 341 4421. Interstate School Inquiries, phone 03 628 2113.